Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a summary of some terrific upcoming programs. We've added several new ones that I can't wait to talk to you about. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Boy, I can't even believe it's November. Everything's going by so quick. How are you doing?
Just fine, thank you.
You have two huge topics today. I think we need to expand the time that we spend with you. This topic about the Virginia governor's race, I can't wait to get your perspective on it. I know we were all glued to the election results last week. And then your second topic, the battle over Roe versus Wade and how Texas will affect U.S. abortion law. Oh, take us through it, Dan.
Yeah, lots to talk about, no question about it. And thank you so much, Kim. And thanks to all of you very much, as always, for being willing to join these conversations. As Kim mentioned, we'll talk about these two issues for the first roughly half of the webinar. And then at the bottom of hour, the amazing Jessica DeGanzik will join me, and we will move on to talking through your questions and observations on these topics and anything else that you care to discuss. So as Kim mentioned, topic number one, a political earthquake hit Virginia last week. Now, for many, many years, Virginia was pretty much of a swing state, a purple state between red and blue America. But in recent years, it's become increasingly Democratic. And in fact, no Republicans won a statewide race in Virginia until last week, since 2009. So when the Republican candidate, the wealthy businessman Glenn Youngkin, unexpectedly defeated the former governor, Democrat Terry McAuliffe, in a state that was thought to be very reliably blue, it set off aftershocks throughout the political universe, because historically, with only very few exceptions, because Virginia is only one of two states, New Jersey being the other, that holds its statewide elections the year after a presidential campaign, generally these two states tend to be the initial report card on the newly elected president from the year earlier. And second, historically, they've been fairly reliable indicators on what we should expect in the midterm elections. So we're going to dig deeper into those results and what they may mean, not just in those two states, but for the 2022 midterm elections in just a minute. But before we do, I'm going to ask Claire to post our first question and to ask all of you what you make of these results. Normally we give you a little bit more time before we spring the first question on you. But like Kim said, I'm willing to assume that many of you were watching this race fairly closely, so we thought we'd spring this on you right away. So how do you see the Virginia election results? Do you see them, number one, as a major concern for Democrats that could potentially cost them Congress next year? Number two, do you see this as a reason for some concern for the Democrats, but no reason for panic? Or third, do you see this as little or no concern for the Democrats, and in fact it was an aberration, and we shouldn't overreact, whether you happen to be a Democrat or Republican, into the results, since the midterms are still almost a year away? So Claire, how do we do? Look at that. Wow. 68% of you, over 2/3 of you, see this as a major concern for Democrats that could cost them control of Congress next year. And of course, we know how small the Democratic margins of majority are right now. Wouldn't take that much to tip them. And by a very large margin, you seem to think that that's a very, very plausible scenario. 30% said some concern, but no need to overreact for the good or the bad. And only 2% were fairly dismissive of the results. So I'm going to go with the 98% and continue talking about this for a few more minutes. And what I will note before we go deeper into Virginia is it is worth noting that at the same time, as Youngkin was elected in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Republicans came within a hair's breadth of pulling off an even more extraordinary upset in New Jersey the same night, and they missed a chance to recapture the governor's office in an even more heavily Democratic state that Biden carried by 16 points last year, falling just 2 or 3 percentage points short of knocking off the incumbent Phil Murphy. And I will tell you, these types of rapid shifts in a 12-month period don't happen all that often in American politics. Historically, Virginia and New Jersey often serve as somewhat of a course correction in the year after a presidential election, in which the out party wins those governor's races. But a shift of double-digit margins in both states is pretty unusual. And while those results don't guarantee political catastrophe, I don't know if they're a reason for major concern for next year's major election. What the results do is they put the onus on the Democrats to develop a new messaging strategy that can reach swing voters more effectively than their candidates did last week. Now, they have 51 weeks to come up with that message, so it's entirely possible. But clearly, you'd rather be the party, in this case the Republicans, that knows what kind of messaging works and continue it and strengthen it going forward, than the party that's just lost trying to figure out a new direction. Now, many leading Democratic strategists laid the blame for their party's problems squarely at the feet of the battling factions in Congress, who'd been unable for months to pass President Biden's signature domestic policy priorities. Now, both progressives and moderates seem to agree that that was a problem. And finally, a few days after the election, they managed to put aside their differences to pass Biden's infrastructure legislation. But there are still very deep divisions between the two sides on the president's more ambitious social spending bills. An agreement on that larger bill still seems to be very, very far away. Now, if you thought that the fight over infrastructure and family leave on these two bills looked ugly, just wait until next year when the Democrats have to dig in deeper on immigration, on public safety and crime, on inflation, and now on education policy. All brawls that are coming up in the next several months between now and the midterms next November. And those were the issues that Republicans leveraged to their benefit last Tuesday, each one of them highlighting a split within the Democratic Party between progressives and moderates, and each one pointing to potential for Republicans to peel swing voters away from the Democrats in what many Republicans at least hope will be a post-Trump political era. Now, of course, we don't know if it's a post-Trump political era or not, because Trump could very well decide to run again in 2024 and to turn the political landscape upside down yet again. But regardless of whether he runs in 2024 or not, Trump's not on the ballot next year. And one of the most important lessons that the Democrats learned in Virginia and New Jersey this fall is that running against Trump is much more difficult when he's not on the ballot. Now, both McAuliffe and Murphy, the Democratic candidates, worked very hard to tie their Republican opponents to Trump, and that was a tactic that worked very well in the 2018 midterms. But voters in those two states, and in the rest of the country for that matter, but even though voters in these two states still think just as unfavorably of Trump as they did a year ago, the fact that he's no longer in office means that their animosity toward Trump isn't nearly as intense, and he's much less relevant to their votes. So now the voters who were most affected, who most impacted, most likely to switch in this campaign, were the suburbanites, the suburban voters that Joe Biden and 4 years before that, Hillary Clinton, had taken away from Trump during the last two presidential elections. One of the reasons for that was the debate over crime and public safety. We've talked before about how while some Democrats are talking about defunding the police, that kind of overreach made it much easier for Republicans to win back voters on a public safety issue that had worked for them for many, many years in the past. But less expected than crime and public safety was the way that Youngkin in Virginia recast the education policy debate in a way that drew many suburban parents to his side, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But before we do, I'd like to ask Claire to post our second question and to get your opinion on this. What do you think was the greatest contributor to last week's outcomes? A, was it the Democrats focused too much on Trump? B, was it McAuliffe's misstatement about parental involvement in education? And I think most of you are familiar with that, but we'll talk more about it in just a minute. Third, do you think it was the way Youngkin talked about education in the context of giving parents more rights and more of a voice in education policy? Fourth, was it the ability of Republicans, particularly Youngkin, to keep Trump at a safe distance? Or finally, was it the inability of the Democrats in Congress to pass an infrastructure bill by election day? Now let's agree that they were all contributors, but let's see if we can figure out from all of you which one was the biggest contributor. And what I see right here is that many of you, 65%, almost 2/3 of you, focused right in on education policy, whether it was McAuliffe's gaffe or the way Youngkin leveraged the question of parental rights. 65% of you focused on education. Only 17% of you thought it was about Trump on one side or the other, and 18% thought it was about the Democrats not being able to pass an infrastructure bill. So let's talk more about education. Now, education has been a winning issue for Democrats since forever. And just like historically crime is an issue that Republicans have used to their advantage, education is almost always an issue that Democrats are able to leverage to their benefit. And there were obviously very highly visible arguments over critical race theory and how topics like civil rights and race relations should be taught in public elementary and secondary schools. That's what got most of the headlines. But if you look a little bit closer, it appears that the resentment that many parents hold towards school administrators and teachers unions, in Virginia at least, was in the aftermath of the extended school shutdowns that many families endured through the coronavirus pandemic. Now, Youngkin was able to harness this anger on behalf of a parents' right movement in his campaign. And because he won, that issue is not going anywhere anytime soon. And so Democrats are going to have to find a way to reassure parents that their voices are being heard and that their concerns are taken seriously. But that's not going to be easy. And so before we go even deeper, let's ask you yet another question. How big an issue do you think education will be in the midterm elections? Many of you thought it was the most important issue last Tuesday, but how about next year when another year has passed? Will it be the single most important issue in the midterm elections the way it was in Virginia? Will it be one of a few major issues, along with perhaps the coronavirus, economy, and possibly others? Or will it go back to being a relatively minor issue, the way it usually is in the statewide races? What do we got, Claire? What did our group have to say on this one? 89% of you, look at that, very interesting, 89% say it'll be one of a few major issues. Add 2% saying it'll be the single most important issue. And over 90% think that education is going to have a very important impact in the midterm elections next year. So let's talk more about it. I mentioned earlier that the critical race theory argument drew the most attention in these campaigns. Now, to be clear, despite what many conservatives say, critical race theory is not taught in elementary or secondary schools. But despite what many liberals say, critical race theory does influence the way that many public schools discuss race-based issues with their students. So both sides are trying to maneuver this issue for their benefit. Up until recently, a largely academic, no pun intended, study that was done in universities about how civil rights and how race relations ought to be taught. But now it's entered the body politic in the mainstream. But it wasn't the only issue. And in fact, exit polls show that it wasn't even the major education issue, even though it received much more attention. There were a lot of other things that drove voters in Virginia. Now, in addition to the disagreement over critical race theory, Youngkin's campaign was harshly criticized for using Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Beloved as an example of what some parents believed was objectionable content in public school curriculum. Now, if you've read Beloved, and it's a Pulitzer Prize winner, like I said, there are unquestionably deeply disturbing passages in the book, and you can understand that some parents might decide that it's not appropriate for their teenagers to read those kind of passages at such a young age. But let's also agree that the selection of a story told by such a celebrated African-American author to illustrate the point undoubtedly added to an already tension-filled debate on top of critical race theory. And we're going to come back to the question of race in just a minute. But for many voters, as I said earlier, the most important issues relating to education is that their public schools had remained closed and had relied on distance learning for such a long time during the pandemic, even while many other aspects of society, and by the way, most charter and private schools, were reopening. That really seems to have been the driving force behind parental dissatisfaction. Another aspect of the parent rights discussion, which received less attention this year, but I think it's important to pay attention to going forward, is the growing movement in many states away from advanced placement classes and other accelerated learning for students who demonstrate unusually high aptitude in certain subjects. Large numbers of suburban parents became greatly upset that their children would not be given those additional opportunities, especially in an era in which there's such heightened competition for college admissions. Now, the argument against these type of classes is that these accelerated classes undermine efforts toward educational and economic equity, and also the commitment to help students from underrepresented communities in other disadvantaged circumstances, which complicates the topic even further for Democratic candidates. But to sum up once again, these issues aren't going away. And while Republicans are going to need to find a way to de-racialize the discussion, Democrats, as the LA Times correctly pointed out today, are going to have to find a better answer than simply calling Republicans racist. There is a large cohort of parents who don't believe their voices are heard to the degree that they ought to in our public school education. And if both Republicans and Democrats pay more attention to those issues, regardless of how it's ultimately resolved, that increased focus on public schools can't help but to be a bad thing. Can't help but to be a good thing. Yikes. I don't know where that came from. Anyway, with that little gaffe of my own, maybe it's not a bad time to move on to our second topic. And we're going to talk about the state of Texas and the battle over Roe versus Wade for the remainder of our time before all of you are able to join us for the conversation. Well, a couple of months ago, as I think most of you know, the state of Texas passed a law that banned most abortions in their state after roughly 6 weeks of pregnancy. And that made the state the most restrictive in the nation in terms of access to abortion services. Now, other states have passed similar laws, but those measures face lots of legal challenges, and we'll come back to that in just a minute or two. The Texas law is the first one to be implemented, and back in September, the U.S. Supreme Court voted 5-4 against blocking it temporarily, staying the law until the court could hear the full case. Now, the reason that the Texas case hasn't faced the kind of legal challenges, this kind of legal obstacles that has happened in other states, is that the Texas law actually bars state officials from enforcing it. And that leaves it to individual citizens or non-government groups to be responsible for taking action. And that law was written specifically, it was designed specifically to make it difficult to challenge in courts. The reason for that is that usually a lawsuit aiming to block a law is unconstitutional, names state officials as defendants. But when you sue the state because state officials are responsible for implementing the law. But because the Texas law deputizes private citizens to sue anyone who performs an abortion or, quote, aids and abets, unquote, a procedure, that means that the state argues that they're protected from federal action. Now, under the Texas law, plaintiffs with no connection to the patient or clinic can sue, and they can recover legal fees as well as up to $10,000 in damages if they win. And the state argues that the state, can't be restricted from action since they're not the ones enforcing it. It's just regular everyday citizens. So as a result of this argument, last week the Supreme Court met again, not to argue whether the abortion restrictions themselves violate Roe versus Wade. That's still down the line. But rather, whether the law can be challenged in court, even though the state of Texas says it can't be. Now, back in September, when the court decided not to stay the law, only 3 Democratic appointed justices, plus Chief Justice Roberts, voted to stay the law. And the other 5, all Republican appointed justices, all voted to let it go forward. But last week, 2 additional Republican appointed judges, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, also sounded very skeptical as to whether privatizing enforcement of a law like this one would undermine the rationale for the US Supreme Court altogether. And this was essentially the argument that the Biden administration made in arguing that the law could be stayed, saying that if a state can pass a law that's in violation of the Supreme Court decision, just because the enforcement is given to its citizens rather than to the state, then what's the point of having a Supreme Court at all? And in addition to the 4 justices who voted for the stay, Roberts and the 3 Democratic appointees, both Barrett and Kavanaugh seemed very, very taken by this argument. Now, Kavanaugh focused specifically on the possibility that allowing the Texas law to stay in effect would lead other states to pass laws that would intrude on other rights protected by the Constitution, and that those violations would be protected the same way that Texas law protects abortion restrictions. Kavanaugh focused on the First and Second Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom to bear arms, and he wondered if those rights could be undermined if this approach was allowed. Now, the other aspect of the case that drew in Kavanaugh and Barrett was the question of financial compensation. Patients themselves can't be sued under the Texas law, but doctors, clinic staffers, counselors, clergy, family members, people who help pay for the procedure, or even those who drive someone to have the procedure done, are all fair game under the Texas law. And as I said earlier, the law allows a plaintiff not only to recover their legal fees, but up to $10,000 if they win. And that means that clinics and other defendants can be sued multiple times over the same abortion. And even if they win, they're not entitled to legal fees. Now, in addition to all that, the law also imposes these penalties retroactively, which brought question from Kavanaugh and from John Roberts, asking if that meant that someone could be sued for millions of dollars, theoretically, for assisting with abortions that had been performed entirely legally ever since the 1970s. And they seem very, very dubious about that. So here's where we are. If either Barrett or Kavanaugh votes with Roberts and the 3 Democratic nominees, not both of them, just one or the other, then the Texas law will be on hold until the court addresses the broader issue. But by the time the court hears the case on whether the Texas law violates Roe versus Wade, it might not matter anymore, because the dispute over the Texas law is the first of 2 major abortion cases to come before the Supreme Court this term. The next one is scheduled for December 1st, when the justices are going to hear arguments about a Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks And that's an even more direct challenge to the constitutional right to abortion established by Roe versus Wade. Now, that's obviously just a few weeks off, and you can bet that we'll be following that one very closely, and we'll be talking about it with you as well once the court has heard that Mississippi case. So Claire, let's put up another question. Let's see what our group thinks about where this is all headed. So question for all of you: how will the US Supreme Court ultimately resolve the abortion questions before it? Option 1, they will uphold Roe versus Wade. Option 2, they won't overturn Roe, but they will allow for very strict state restrictions on legal abortion. Or third, alternatively, they will overturn Roe versus Wade, and abortion will be left to the states, which means, according to expert analysis, roughly half of the states in this country will then outlaw abortion and half will still allow it. So of those three options, what do you think is the most plausible outcome once the Supreme Court has heard both the Texas and the Mississippi cases? 76% of you, very interesting, 3/4 choose the middle ground here. You don't believe that the court will overturn Roe, but that it will allow for much stricter state restrictions. And much smaller numbers think there'll be a black or white decision, either clearly upholding or overturning Roe v. Wade. Well, a couple of last points to make on this topic before we open it to your questions and observations. First, it's important to remember, and we've talked about this issue before on previous episodes of this webinar, it's important to remember that voters in this country are still very closely divided on whether they consider themselves to be pro-choice or pro-life, very closely divided. And even many pro-choice voters do support some additional restrictions. So politically speaking, this is a much more complicated issue with much less predictable outcomes than it first appears. But when the question isn't asked about being pro-choice or pro-life, but rather when the question is phrased as whether Roe versus Wade should be upheld or overturned, the results are much more one-sided. Very large majorities believe that Roe v. Wade should be upheld. And even many self-described pro-life voters do not want to see Roe overturned. So on a question about whether people consider themselves pro-choice or pro-life, that's pretty close to evenly split, slightly leaning in the pro-choice direction, but only slightly. But when you ask about Roe versus Wade, the numbers shift very, very dramatically. And that leads to my second point. Many observers believe that the conservatives' real target with these legal challenges is not Roe versus Wade. And this goes back to how many of you answered the previous question. Many experts believe that the conservatives' real target is not Roe versus Wade, but rather the 1992 follow-up case to Roe, the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision. And in 1992, in the Casey decision, the court upheld Roe versus Wade on the question of keeping abortion legal, but it also said that the standard for implementing laws restricting abortion should be decided on what's known as a, quote, undue burden, unquote, standard. In other words, implementing laws restricting abortion should be decided on what is known as an undue burden standard. And a lot of people believe that the reason then Justice Kennedy voted to uphold Roe v. Wade was because this undue burden standard perhaps made it easier to implement more strict parameters on when abortions could be performed legally. Now, this question of an undue burden standard is a principle that goes way beyond abortion. In fact, it goes way back to the 19th century. And the undue burden standard, regardless of the issue on which it's implemented, it states that a legislature cannot make a particular law that is too burdensome or too restrictive of an individual's fundamental rights. And in the context of abortion rights, the court ruled in the Casey decision back in 1992 that laws, in fact, can be passed that limit the number of abortions performed as long as those laws don't absolutely eliminate abortion access. Now, many pro-life advocates believe that this undue burden standard from the Casey decision is, from their perspective, a better and a safer approach because they believe it would be a more durable and longer lasting approach, which would enjoy greater support from the public than an absolute overturn of Roe versus Wade. You heard my reference to the poll numbers on that earlier. So as these two cases move forward, the Mississippi case in December and Texas sometime after that, don't just think about Roe versus Wade. Think about the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case decision instead, and the question of undue burden, which can dramatically limit the number of legal abortions without making them illegal. So once again, we see that our audience, the large majority of them, understands these issues in a pretty sophisticated way. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. How about you, Jessica? Does it surprise you?
Nothing surprises me with our audience. Well, yeah, before we launch into the Q&A session, I would like to thank our members and viewers for your continued support. We depend on your donations and membership to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you are able to make a donation, please go to our website at www.lawacth.org and click on the donate button or become a member. We greatly appreciate your support. All right, let's jump into these questions. The first one, had infrastructure been passed prior to the Virginia election, do you believe the result would have differed?
I don't know the answer to that. Both Virginia senators, both Senators Kaine and Warner, both Democrats, have said that they believe that McAuliffe likely would have won had the infrastructure bill passed, not so much because voters have understood the specifics of it, but because it would have demonstrated that Biden and the Democrats were getting things done in Washington. And it's worth noting that for much of his campaign, McAuliffe was very critical of his fellow Democrats in Congress for not moving the bill forward, which suggests to me that he thought that it was damaging his chances. There's no way to know for sure, but if you look at the way he conducted himself during the campaign and the way the state's two senators responded afterwards, it seems like McAuliffe would have been in a much stronger position had that bill passed. On the flip side, it's very clear that McAuliffe's defeat may have motivated Democrats in Congress, moderates and progressives, to put aside at least some of their differences in order to pass the bill. Now, as I said earlier, they're going to have to come back with a much more difficult challenge with the reconciliation social spending legislation. But I think it's safe to say that whether McAuliffe would have won or not had the infrastructure bill passed, it's pretty clear that the infrastructure bill would not have passed had not McAuliffe lost.
Thank you. As a follow-up to the infrastructure question, do you think the Republicans that supported it will see increased support or increased pressure to be primaried in next year's elections? And what were the progressives, why were the progressives against this infrastructure bill?
There were 13 Republicans who voted for the bill and 6 Democrats who voted against it. So starting by talking about those Republicans who voted for it, first, remember that when the bill passed the Senate, an even larger number of Republicans voted for it, including Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. So the fact that some Republicans voted for it is not unprecedented. House Leader Kevin McCarthy tried to convince his members to vote against it because he wanted to deprive Biden of a win because he felt that would help Republicans heading into next year's midterm elections. The 13 Republicans who voted for it, a few of them are retiring. Most of those who are not retiring are from the New York and New Jersey area, which will benefit disproportionately from the legislation. So the answer to the question is both. In the short run, it's very likely that those Republicans who voted for the bill who aren't retiring will face some type of primary challenge. But it's also fairly clear that should they survive that primary challenge, they'll be much better positioned in a general election, having voted for a bill that many of their constituents believe will be of such use to them. The half a dozen Democratic progressives who voted against it essentially said one of two things. Either they didn't think it was strong enough, particularly in the climate change area, or second, that they didn't trust Democratic moderates to come back and now vote for the broader social spending bill when it comes before them. For a few minutes, it looked like those 6 progressives might be able to take down the bill, but Pelosi did see fairly soon that at least a small number of Republicans are going to vote for it, which made the progressives' opposition more symbolic than anything else.
Do you consider the loss in Virginia as putting an asterisk on the poor messaging of the Democratic Party, not only there, but everywhere?
As I alluded to in the opening segment, I'd caution anyone against overreading into these results. And I feel like most of our respondents were pretty measured in what they had to say. One of the things politicians of both parties always do and have always done is they overreact. They get way too excited when something good happens and get way too upset when something bad happens. And so Republicans have every reason to be happy, but they're a little bit giddier than they probably have the right to be, given the outcome of this election. And Democrats should be concerned because it's very clear to them that running an anti-Trump message and not having a better answer on education issues is something that really hurt them. But that's not cause for panic. Like I said earlier, they have 51 weeks to figure out a message that can be more effective in 2022 than the one they attempted in 2021. So I don't know that I would put an asterisk after the result, but I would note that these are 2 states out of 50, and while they can provide us some guidance going forward, we should be careful and on how heavily we rely on them when we're looking to next year. Certainly a good day for Republicans, certainly an added benefit for Republicans going forward. But these results are a long way from being definitive, almost a year before the midterm elections actually take place.
Could it be that the Democratic negative campaign might be the issue? McAuliffe was not the same happy politician as for his first campaign for governor, and this questioner lives in Virginia.
Well, this is something very similar to the criticisms we saw leveled against Hillary Clinton after her campaign in 2016. One of the lessons the Democrats learned after Clinton's defeat is because the Clinton campaign spent so much time talking about Trump, they didn't spend nearly enough time talking to the voters about what their candidate would do if she was elected. If you think about every campaign as a window of opportunity through which a candidate can deliver his or her message to voters, the more of that window that's taken up talking about your opponent, the less time and space there is to talk about the things that you want to do. In 2018 and 2020, Democrats were very careful not to repeat that mistake. And while they certainly were very harsh in their criticism of Trump, they made a much more concerted effort, having learned the lesson from Clinton in 2016, that while they did need to criticize Trump, they also needed to leave enough time in the window of opportunity to talk about their own message. And it does seem that in 2021, that both McAuliffe and Murphy may have forgotten that lesson that Biden had learned and gone back to a Clinton approach that was so overwhelmingly targeted toward Trump, there wasn't enough time for voters to hear about the issues on which they originally intended to run.
What was the point of the Lincoln Project sending out operatives dressed up with tiki torches to a Youngkin event? Didn't it backfire and undermine their credibility?
Well, the Lincoln Project, which is a group of former Republican political operatives who were very active in the 2020 campaign, this is an ongoing story, and I'll offer a disclaimer that I know many of the individuals involved in that effort, and I worked with some of them in the past, back when I was a Republican before I switched to no party preference. And in the aftermath of the 2020 campaign, some of you may have read stories that demonstrated that the people running the Lincoln Project, an anti-Trump paid media campaign, that the people running it took very large amounts of money, unusually large amounts of money, out of the fundraising for themselves and spent a much smaller amount on paid advertising than most political organizations will. And so their credibility was somewhat damaged in the aftermath of the 2020 campaign. One, because a lot of people who gave them money thought that that money was going to result in direct advertising, not in profits for the individuals. But there was also a great deal of infighting within the organization, a lot of finger pointings and people who resigned from the organization. So they lost some credibility even in 2020. But for those of you who missed the story, in the closing weeks of the 2021 Virginia race, the Lincoln Project, these former Republicans devoted to defeating Trump and his allies, sent 5 individuals to a Youngkin event, proclaiming their support for Youngkin, but also indicating their ties perhaps to fascist, if not Nazi, organizations. It was very quickly found out that these weren't actually Youngkin supporters, that in fact that it was a stunt pulled by the Lincoln Project, and I do think it damaged their credibility very severely. And I don't think the organization is going away, but it's going to be much more difficult for them to attract financial support in the future, given the blows to their reputation that these self-inflicted blows to their reputation that have been incurred over the last 2 elections.
The final margin in the New Jersey race is 3%. Haven't you exaggerated the closeness of the race?
I don't think so. It's worth noting that just 1 year ago, Biden won that state by 16 points. No Republican presidential candidate has won New Jersey since 1988, and the last time a Republican won a statewide election there for any office was Chris Christie many years ago. So the fact that Murphy won is certainly a point of relief for Democrats, and a win even by 1 single vote is still a win. So I don't want to underestimate the import of Democrats holding that office. But the fact that the vote shifted from plus 16 Democratic to plus 3 Democratic in 1 year, a 13-point shift, is roughly as considerable as the shift that took place in Virginia. Because in 2020, Biden won the state of Virginia by 10 points, then McAuliffe lost by 2. In both states, in 2 close races, the shift was double digits, and it's not frequent in American politics that we see a state's partisan leanings change that quickly.
How do you reconcile McAuliffe's narrow defeat with the overwhelming defeat of the Newsom recall?
I think there are a couple of differences between Virginia and California, and it's entirely possible that McAuliffe and almost Murphy overlearned the lessons from the California recall campaign. The 2 big differences. One, while Virginia has leaned Democratic in recent years, California is much, much more heavily Democratic than Virginia. As I mentioned earlier, Biden won Virginia by about 10 points, very safely. But his margin here in California was roughly 3 times that. So one is that this is a much more heavily Democratic state. But I think the other difference, and one of the reasons we didn't see a 10, 12, 13-point shift here, the way we did in Virginia and New Jersey last week, was the nature of the leading Republican candidate. Larry Elder, whether you happen to be a supporter or an opponent of his, did not try to distance himself from Donald Trump the way that Youngkin did in Virginia. In fact, he ran very closely to Trump and ran a very similarly combative and confrontational campaign. One of Youngkin's greatest strengths is even though Trump endorsed him, Youngkin was able to keep him at a distance. Elder didn't attempt that same type of distancing, and particularly in a deep blue state like California, it hurt him very, very badly. The question now, and we'll talk about this at some point in the future, is whether California Republicans will decide that running a candidate like Elder against Gavin Newsom next year would be an enjoyable exercise again, or whether a candidate more like Youngkin might be a potentially more effective course to take. I don't know the answer to that, but I promise you that this is a very, very considered debate going on within California Republican circles right now, and will be for the next several months.
Republicans historically focus on topics to quote unquote scare voters. This time it is CRT. People have no idea what CRT is. How do Democrats defend against this?
I'd say 2 things. Number one, I think both parties are very talented at scaring voters. Republicans often do it on crime. Democrats do it on abortion rights. Republicans are using this issue like critical race theory. Democrats talk about the potential damage of climate change one of the things we know, not just among voters, but among human beings, is it is human nature to respond more to a threat than a promise. And so what effective messengers in both parties have done for many years is attempted to frighten voters about what their opponents might do if elected office. So I don't know that one party or the other has the corner on this. As it relates specifically to critical race theory, most voters don't know what it is. As I said earlier, this is historically, since the 1970s or so, been a discussion that's taken place primarily in higher education circles about how race relations and civil rights ought to be talked about in the context of American history. As I said during the opening segment, what conservatives don't mention is that critical race theory is not taught in high schools, or certainly not in elementary schools. But what liberals and progressives don't mention is the critical race theory does often shape the way American history is taught in elementary or secondary schools. So most voters don't know the specifics of it. And we probably should do, Jessica, maybe a more detailed discussion of this topic in a future webinar. But as I said a little bit earlier, from the exit polling and the analysis that I've seen, while some voters responded very, very strongly to this critical race theory debate on one side or the other, that the parental rights discussion really did have its greatest resonance in issues relating to school shutdowns and accelerated and advanced learning. My own opinion on critical race theory and on the teaching of race relations and civil rights in American history is that for those of you regular viewers, you know I'm a middle ground kind of guy. And so my middle ground on this is I think it's entirely possible to construct a curriculum in high schools and in elementary schools that talks both about all the positive things that this country and its leaders have done, while also acknowledging the horrible mistakes that have been made. And I think on the extremes of this critical race theory debate in both directions is an assumption that does need to be much more cut and dried. Either talk only about the wonderful things this country has accomplished, or primarily only about the horrible things that we have done when we've made mistakes. Ultimately, I think that our students are smarter and more perceptive than we give them credit for. And explaining to them that this is a good country that has accomplished a lot of positive things in the world over 200 plus years, but that has made some very bad mistakes along the way, is a reasonable middle ground that the overwhelming majority of voters in both parties, I think, would support. But longer conversation than that on the subject for another day.
Might the overturning in whole or in part of Roe be a political gift to the Democrats, just like Roe was a political gift to Republicans?
Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the poll numbers on abortion are more complicated in this country than we commonly believe. But like I said, on the question of whether someone considers themselves pro-choice versus pro-life, those numbers are not, the margins are not all that big. But the questioner is correct, because as I did say earlier, most voters, very large majority of voters, do not want to overturn Roe versus Wade. That's why I suggested at the end of the first half an hour that in fact, many pro-life advocates' real goal is not Roe versus Wade, but rather Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And if, as the overwhelming majority of our poll respondents indicated, if the outcome here is not the absolute outlawing of Roe versus Wade, which I suspect would be damaging for Republicans, but rather stricter restrictions or allowing states to impose stricter limits on abortion, that's probably not as clear-cut a political outcome one way or another. An outcome of Roe versus Wade, I think the questioner is right. But stricter limitations is going to play much differently in different states. And I think one of the things that would lessen its impact is states that would react most angrily toward additional restrictions on abortion rights are almost by definition states that would not impose them. Whereas more conservative states whose voters might be more inclined to enact stricter limits are probably not going to react badly to those limits. So what we do end up once again is with a red and blue America, with red states imposing these stricter limitations and finding that to be perfectly acceptable, blue states increasing access to abortion and finding that to be perfectly acceptable, and by and large grumbling across state and party lines about what those other people in other parts of the country are doing that we don't approve of in our state.
With Texas law, what is the definition of a law? Doesn't the Texas construct, it might be constitution, encourage vigilantism? How can it be a law if the government is not the enforcing body?
This is precisely the question before the U.S. Supreme Court. When Texas fashioned this law, they relied on a number of constitutional lawyers, constitutional experts, who said that the party responsible for enforcing the law is not definitional in whether a law exists or not. And the critics of this particular legislation do refer to it as vigilante justice, because it would be a law that would be enforced by citizens rather than by the state. It was obviously done as a very clever way of trying to avoid the Supreme Court coming in and potentially overturning the law. We don't know what's going to happen yet. The questioner obviously believes that by definition, a law that grants enforcement authority to individuals rather than the state is not a law. Texas argues otherwise. We'll see what the justices decide. It's fairly clear that at least 4 will agree with the questioner. The unanswered question, which we'll learn in the weeks ahead, is whether either Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Barrett agrees to it.
The New York Times reported that the breakthrough that led to passage of the infrastructure bill was due to the intervention of the Congressional Black Caucus. Do you agree with this analysis? And if so, do you believe it portends further success for the Democrats?
I do agree with that analysis. And it's been very widely reported that when it seemed like it was going to be almost virtually impossible for Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and President Biden to bring the moderates and progressives together, is the Congressional Black Caucus went to see Speaker Pelosi and fashioned a potential compromise. And what's really interesting is that Pelosi understood right away that the leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus would have more credibility, particularly with progressives, than she did, given the way the debate over the infrastructure bill had gone on for the previous weeks. So what's worth noting is that when that compromise was forwarded, Pelosi backed off. And it was the leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus that led the news conference suggesting to both moderates and progressives that progressives agree to pass the infrastructure bill if moderates, number one, pass a rule leading to the passage of the broader social services bill, but also committing to passing it once the Congressional Budget Office had completed its fiscal analysis. Would both sides have taken Pelosi's word for it? Probably not. Would they have taken Biden's word for it? We don't know. But the Congressional Black Caucus, having credibility with progressives and moderates for very different reasons, was able to broach the deal. And I think it's a really good reminder. It is potentially good for the Democratic Party. And it's also worth remembering that the reason Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee for president was because of his support from African-American political leaders and later African-American voters. And in fact, the endorsement of Representative Jim Clyburn before the South Carolina primary, which mobilized the African-American vote immensely in Biden's favor, even after he lost the first few primary states, is considered to be the key to Biden's turnaround and ultimately his nomination and ultimately his election. But it's also a good reminder that minority voters, not just African-American, but Latino and Asian Pacific as well, are often not nearly as progressive as the most liberal voices in the Democratic Party. And in fact, voters of color can often be much more moderate on any number of issues. And if those minority caucuses continue to play the broker role for the Democrats going forward to the question, I think it has the potential, at least, to be a very positive thing for the Democratic Party in terms of the unity it needs with such small congressional majorities.
Should Representative Gosar be charged with incitement to violence based on his tweet?
Yes. Okay, next question.
Any thoughts about the Pew study identifying 9 distinct U.S. political categories?
Oh, for those of you who might not have seen it, the Pew Research Center, which does extraordinarily impressive public opinion research and polling, came out with a study just in the last day or so, dividing the electorate into 9 different categories. I think what's most notable about those categories, 4 Democrat, 4 Republican, and 1 just sort of alienated, for lack of a better word, is it offers reinforces an important message to us, which is reflected in the discussion we've been having about the congressional negotiations, is we really only have 2 parties in this country in name only. There are multiple Democratic parties. There are multiple Republican parties. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Dianne Feinstein are both Democrats, but they're very, very different types of Democrats. Mitt Romney and Donald Trump both call themselves Republicans, but are very, very different types of Republicans. And what this Pew study does, and I'd encourage you to go to the Pew Research website, anyone who's interested, and look it up, is it talks in great detail about the different factions within each party, the issues on which they overlap, and the issues on which they're very different. So once again, perhaps a full topic for another webinar, because it really is a very detailed report. But for those of you who find these types of things interesting, I would recommend visiting both the Pew Research Center website, or there's also an excellent analysis of the report on the Washington Post website as of this afternoon.
Probably our final question. Can you comment on Biden and Kamala Harris's increasingly low approval ratings? What is Kamala up to these days to earn her such low approval?
Well, this was one of our topics a week or 2 ago, and Biden's approval ratings, the drop in his approval ratings, I think can be linked to a few things. The first was the nature of our country's withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that while even most American voters very strongly supported with the withdrawal, they did not like the way the Biden administration did it, and it really undermined Biden's reputation as an experienced and competent leader, which was the basis of his message against Trump last year. Second is the ongoing increase in inflation. And what we're seeing in polling now is that in addition to voters being more likely to disapprove of Biden, they don't think he's paying attention to the issues that are most important to them. Gasoline prices, grocery prices are what many Americans are focusing on now. And just like the guy in charge or the person in charge gets way too much credit when things are good, they get way too much blame when things are bad. So along with Afghanistan, the economy, and particularly inflation, is bringing down Biden's numbers. And then third and most important, I think ultimately this comes back more than anything to the Delta variant. Remember late spring, early summer, there's about a month there when we all thought that vaccines made us invulnerable. Well, the Biden administration, like the rest of us, believed the hype until the Delta variant reemerged. I think a very exhausted American public, thinking that we would get through this as a country now that we had a new leader, was very disillusioned and disappointed. Intellectually, most voters know that Biden didn't cause the Delta variant any more than Trump caused the original pandemic. But because the virus has persisted much longer than many of us thought, on Biden's watch, he's taken some of the blame for that. As far as Harris, she's been relatively low profile over the course of her first several months as vice president. And the couple times that she has been more visible, she's had mixed results. We've talked in previous webinars about her trip to Guatemala and Mexico to talk about the root causes of immigration. She was also tasked with taking on the voting rights issue. And I suspect that the lack of progress on those 2 issues that were very visibly handed to her may contribute to her fairly low public opinion ratings. It's worth noting that a few weeks ago, a group of very, very highly placed Democratic strategists and donors gathered for dinner to discuss that if in the eventuality that Joe Biden did not seek a second term, these strategists and donors began discussions on whether it would be possible to line up behind Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg as the next Democratic nominee for president, rather than Vice President Harris. Buttigieg immediately disavowed the group, and to be fair, he wasn't involved and he wasn't present. But it's interesting that such highly placed Democrats are already having conversations like that, even so far in advance of the next election.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to our audience as well. Just a reminder that after Dan's webinar next Tuesday, we will have a members only after the webinar session with him. So if you're not a member, become a member so you can join us, and make sure to sign up for that. And otherwise, I'm going to turn this back over to Dan and Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. As always, we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jessica. Dan, terrific discussion as always. And we can't wait till next Tuesday at 5 o'clock for more insights and therapy on all of these crazy topics.
I don't know what the topics will be yet, but there will be certainly plenty more to talk about next Tuesday night. So I hope many of you will come back.
A very busy news cycle. Well, stay on while I take us through. We have some terrific programs coming up. This Wednesday, Deputy Mayor of Los Angeles on international relations. On Friday, Assignment Russia, a foreign correspondent's insight into the Cold War. On Wednesday next week, on the 17th, a roundtable discussion with Commissioner Jamie Lee. She's the Commissioner of the Port of Los Angeles, and we'll be talking about the whole supply chain issue. On the 18th, Blockbuster or Bust, a new lesson in film history with industry insider and expert Kevin Getz. He's been on before and he is very entertaining, so I highly recommend it. And on December 2nd, the role of higher education in California's future with University of California President Michael Drake. And of course, next Tuesday, 5 o'clock, politics in the time of coronavirus. So please go to our website at lawacth.org. Register today. Become a member, make a donation. Every little bit helps. Stay safe, stay informed. Dan,
thanks so much, Kim. Thanks, everybody.